In the summer of 1996, in the small city of Idaho Falls, Idaho, a young woman's life was taken in one of the most brutal and violent acts imaginable. What followed was not justice, but a catastrophic failure of the system itself. A failure so profound that it would take nearly 25 years, the dedication of a relentless mother, the advancement of genetic technology, and a discarded cigarette butt to finally reveal the truth. This is the story of Angie Dodge. To understand the tragedy that would unfold, we must first understand the person at the center of it. Angie Dodge was 18 years old in the spring of 1996. She was not just any teenager. Those who knew her describe a young woman who carried herself with a particular kind of presence. Intelligent, confident, stubborn. She had the blonde hair and piercing eyes of her mother, Carol Dodge, along with something equally distinctive, a refusal to tolerate nonsense. In a community where many young people drifted through adolescence without much direction, Angie stood apart. She was one of the few in her circle to graduate from high school with honors. She was academically gifted enough to tutor other students in mathematics and English. Her friends called her a big, bright, beautiful character, someone whose personality seemed to fill whatever room she occupied. But Angie was also a girl on the threshold of independence. Like many 18-year-olds, she was eager to step out from under the watchful eye of her mother. Carol Dodge was a woman of strong convictions, quick to speak her mind, quick to set boundaries. There were disagreements between mother and daughter, small conflicts that felt enormous in the moment, the kind of friction that comes with adolescence and the struggle toward adulthood. After a particularly significant argument over a house rule, Angie made a decision. She had found her first apartment, a simple upstairs unit in a faded wood-paneled building on a quiet street in the north of Idaho Falls. She had a job at a local beauty supply store. She would live on her own. 3 weeks. That was all the independence Angie Dodge would have. The night before her death, she had a gathering at her apartment. It was a warm June evening in 1996, the kind of weather where people spill outdoors, where the night feels full of possibility. Friends came and went. There was laughter, conversation, the ordinary texture of a young adult's social life. Among the group were people Angie had known for some time, young people who belonged to an informal collective that had given themselves a name, the River Rats. They were a loose confederation of teenagers and young adults, mostly between 16 and 22, who had bonded over time by their shared love of hanging out by the Snake River, the waterway that ran not far from Angie's apartment. They came from different schools across the area but had coalesced into a tight-knit group. Angie had moved to Idaho Falls years earlier and had integrated into this community seamlessly. She had a gift for friendship. That night, the gathering at her apartment was unremarkable. Bags of garbage sat next to the stove. On the outside deck, ashtrays held spent cigarettes, and plastic cups bore the residue of the previous evening's socializing. Nothing suggested to anyone present that this was the last night Angie Dodge would be alive. After her guests left, she would have gone to bed. She should have felt safe in her own apartment, in her own bed, in the sanctuary of her first taste of independent living. She did not wake up the next morning. On the morning of Thursday, June 13, 1996, 2 of Angie's co-workers from the beauty supply store became concerned. She had not shown up for her shift. Their calls went unanswered. Worried, they drove to her apartment to check on her. The door was unlocked, an unusual detail that would later take on enormous significance. They called out for Angie as they entered. There was no response. They moved through the small apartment, past the kitchen with its garbage bags, checking room by room. When they reached the bedroom at the back of the apartment, they found a scene that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Angie Dodge lay on the floor, her back against the wall beside a blood-soaked mattress. Her hands rested at her sides. The carpet beneath her body was saturated with blood. She had been sexually assaulted. She had been stabbed, repeatedly. There was a large, deep cut across her throat. Medical examiners would later determine that her body bore more than a dozen puncture wounds. There was no forced entry to the apartment, but there were unmistakable signs of a struggle. This was violence of an extreme and personal nature. The police arrived within hours. What they encountered was, in the words of Detective Jeff Pratt, who had already spent 15 years in his career by that point, the most horrific crime scene he had ever witnessed. He described Angie as having been nearly decapitated. A stuffed teddy bear, once soft and innocent, lay soaked in blood near Angie's bed. A bloody handprint marked the wall. The scene told a story of desperation, of a young woman fighting for her life against an attacker whose rage seemed boundless. The medical examiners who conducted Angie's autopsy determined that her death had occurred sometime between 12:45 a.m. and 11:15 a.m. on Thursday, June 13, 1996. The exact hour could not be pinpointed, but the window was narrow enough to guide the investigation forward. Now, there was one element of this crime that would prove crucial in ways both obvious and deeply troubling. The killer had left behind biological evidence. During the sexual assault, he had ejaculated, leaving behind semen that would be collected as part of the rape kit. He had left hair, he had left skin cells. The police collected all of it. They took away Angie's bedding, they took away her clothing, and they took away a sample of the killer's DNA, what one forensic expert, Dr. Greg Hampikian, would later describe as a pristine profile. It was, he noted, a neat semen sample taken directly from the victim's body. It was a really good sample, a pristine profile. This was not some degraded or uncertain genetic material. This was the complete, unambiguous identification of one man to the exclusion of everyone else on the planet. In 1996, DNA technology was not what it is today, but it was sophisticated enough to provide investigators with an invaluable tool. The Idaho Falls Police Department moved quickly. In the weeks following Angie's murder, they began collecting DNA samples from people in her life. Her friends, people who had been at the gathering the night before she died, acquaintances, neighbors. The detectives conducted interviews with nearly everyone they could identify as having any connection to Angie. One after another, they swabbed mouths, collected samples, sent them for testing. Almost 100 different DNA samples were collected. Test after test came back negative. The killer was not among the people they had initially suspected. The summer of 1996 turned to fall. The investigation continued, but the case had stalled. Weeks passed, then months. By the end of that year, and into early 1997, the Idaho Falls Police Department had been unable to identify the person who had murdered Angie Dodge. The crime scene had been professionally processed. The evidence had been carefully collected and preserved. But there was a killer still walking free, and the police had no clear suspect. Then, in early 1997, something happened that would dramatically shift the direction of the investigation. On January 5, 1997, a man named Benjamin Hobbs was arrested in Ely, Nevada, roughly 400 miles away from Idaho Falls, and charged with raping a woman at knife point. It was a striking coincidence, or so it seemed. A man known to Angie Dodge, arrested for a violent sexual assault involving a knife, in a state far from home. The similarities to Angie's murder were immediately apparent to the police. A woman raped, a woman stabbed, a man who had apparently fled far away from Idaho. The police began to investigate the possibility that Benjamin Hobbs was Angie's killer. They interviewed Hobbs. They interviewed his friends. Among those friends was a 20-year-old named Christopher Tapp. Tapp and Angie had been part of the same River Rats community. They had been seen together at gatherings along the Snake River. He had been at the gathering at Angie's apartment the night before she died. On January 7, 1997, the police brought Tapp in for his first interview. Christopher Tapp at that time was a young man without much direction. He was a high school dropout. He didn't maintain steady employment. He moved between friends' houses, effectively living as a freeloader. He had time on his hands, and he spent a lot of it with the River Rats. He did not initially present himself as a person of particular interest. He was one among many young people in Angie's orbit. But the police had a theory forming in their minds. They believed Benjamin Hobbs might be connected to Angie's murder. They wanted to know what Hobbs had said to his friends. They wanted to know if Tapp knew anything, or if Tapp had been present, or if Hobbs had confided in him. They asked leading questions. They suggested in various ways that Tapp knew more than he was saying. They made it clear that they suspected him of involvement. Tapp, for his part, told them the truth as he knew it. He said he knew nothing about Angie's murder. He said neither he nor Hobbs had anything to do with it. He became frustrated with the line of questioning. At one point, he told the police, I don't know what you guys want. I wasn't there. After that first interview on January 7th, Tapp was released. The police had no evidence against him. His DNA was not at the crime scene. They let him go. But they did not forget about him. On January 10th, 1997, Christopher Tapp was brought in for a second interview. This time, the pressure had intensified. This time, the police had a theory they wanted to test. Over the course of this interview, something shifted in Tapp's demeanor. Where he had been adamant in his first interview, now he began to waver. Where he had been certain of his innocence, now doubt crept in. By the end of that second interview, Tapp had changed his story. He now told the police that Benjamin Hobbs had murdered Angie Dodge and that Hobbs had asked him to provide an alibi. The police were satisfied with this. They scheduled a third interview for the following day, January 11th, 1997. But before that interview could take place, something happened that would set the trajectory for everything that followed. Tapp's parents, recognizing that their son was in potential legal jeopardy, hired an attorney. They instructed their son not to go to the police station for that third interview without legal representation. When Tapp failed to appear on January 11th, the police did not wait. They went to his house. When Tapp's mother told them that her son would come to the station on January 13th with his attorney to answer questions, the police did not accept this. They returned with an arrest warrant. They charged Christopher Tapp with being an accessory to a felony. The presence of an attorney should have changed everything. It should have signaled to the police that they needed to operate within clear legal boundaries. It should have meant that Tapp had a shield against pressure tactics, a voice advocating for his rights. And to some extent, an attorney was present during the interviews that followed. But what occurred over the next several weeks was a masterclass in psychological coercion. Christopher Tapp entered into a series of interviews with police detectives. These interviews were videotaped. The attorney watched from a monitor in another room, maintaining a presence but not always interjecting or objecting as forcefully as might have been necessary. One of the officers conducting these interviews was Jared Furman, who had previously been a school resource officer and was known to Tapp, a person Tapp might instinctively trust. Over the course of approximately 60 hours, spread across multiple sessions, Christopher Tapp was interrogated. What happened during these interrogations would later be analyzed by Dr. Stephen Drizin, a law professor at Northwestern Pritzker School of Law and an expert on false confessions. Drizin reviewed the videotapes of Tapp's interrogations and concluded that he was witnessing one of the most contaminated confessions he had seen in more than 15 years of reviewing such cases. The police, Drizin found, had threatened Tapp with the death penalty. They told him he would go to the gas chamber. When Tapp insisted on his innocence, they suggested that his memory was faulty, that he had repressed what he had witnessed, that trauma had blocked his recollection of events. They fed him information about the crime, details that only the killer or a witness would know, and later claimed that these details had come from Tapp himself. They administered polygraph tests, repeatedly telling Tapp that the machines showed he was lying, that his denials were false, that the science had proven his guilt, when in fact polygraph results are not conclusive and are subject to interpretation. Most critically, they offered immunity. They told Tapp that if he cooperated, if he told them what they believed to be the truth about what had happened to Angie Dodge, he would only be charged with aiding and abetting an aggravated battery. This was a profound incentive. Tapp believed that if he told the police what they wanted to hear, he could avoid spending his life in prison. But there was a problem. The DNA evidence kept returning negative results. On January 18, 1997, the tests came back on Benjamin Hobbs. His DNA did not match the sample from the crime scene. On January 27th, the tests came back on Jeremy Sargis, another friend Tapp had implicated in his changing stories. His DNA also did not match. His alibi checked out. The police had to confront a troubling reality. The people Tapp was naming were not the perpetrator. The DNA evidence was exonerating them. Rather than step back and reconsider their entire approach, the police took a different tack. On January 29th, they voided Tapp's immunity agreement. They claimed he had been untruthful. And then they changed their strategy. They took Tapp to the crime scene itself. In the presence of detectives, without his attorney present, his attorney had declined to go, Tapp was led through Angie's apartment. What happened next was devastating. After returning from the crime scene, Tapp told a new story. Now, he said, he had not just been present and watched. Now, he said, he had held Angie down during the rape and stabbing. Now, he said, he had participated in the murder itself. On January 30th, Tapp took a fifth polygraph test. During this examination, the police told him something remarkable. They told him that he had passed the test. But they also noted in their report that he was deceptive in his answer about participating in the crime. They were essentially saying, "The machine says you're telling the truth, but we're going to tell you the opposite." They told him that his fear was understandable, that he might have participated in the attack because Hobbs threatened to kill him if he didn't. In other words, they offered him a psychological escape route. If Tapp admitted to cutting Angie across the breast, if he admitted to participation born out of terror, his actions would be understandable, survivable. Tapp accepted this narrative. He confessed to stabbing Angie Dodge because he believed his life would be taken if he refused. He confessed to holding her down. He confessed to participating in her rape and murder. What followed was inevitable. In February 1997, Christopher Tapp was charged with first-degree murder, rape, and use of a deadly weapon in the commission of a felony. The police had their suspect. The case would move forward to trial. But there was something deeply, fundamentally wrong with this picture. And a select few people would recognize it. By the time Tapp was charged and processed into the system, several things were clear to anyone paying attention. Tapp's story had changed 5 times. Each iteration had been prompted by police pressure, by new theories introduced by detectives, by the presentation of evidence, or the threat of prosecution. The DNA evidence from the crime scene had excluded both Tapp and all the other people he had implicated. There was no physical evidence connecting Tapp to the murder, no fibers, no fingerprints, nothing but his own words, words that had been extracted through psychological manipulation. One person who would begin to recognize the injustice was Tom Heavey, a detective who began to examine the case with fresh eyes. Heavey had not been part of the original investigation. He came to the case later and looked at the evidence with the perspective of an outsider. What he saw alarmed him. The videotapes of Tapp's interrogations, Heavey realized, showed something remarkable. Chris Tapp had no actual knowledge of the crime. "It kept jumping out to me that this guy didn't know anything," Heavey said. "Chris told 6 separate stories. He goes from saying he wasn't there to confessing that he stabbed her. I thought, why is he constantly changing it?" Heavey noticed the red flags. He saw the deception, the manipulation, what he called major league brainwashing, occurring in real time on the videotapes. He observed that Tapp seemed to believe the polygraph was an infallible instrument, a machine that could read his subconscious mind and prove he was lying. The detectives had convinced him that his conscious denials were false, that his subconscious remembered the crime even though his conscious mind had repressed it due to trauma. It was psychological manipulation of the highest order. Heavey would spend more than 2 years trying to prove that Tapp had been coerced into a false confession. But his efforts came too late to stop what was already in motion. The trial of Christopher Tapp for the murder and rape of Angie Dodge took place in 1998. A jury heard the prosecution's case. They heard Tapp's confession. They heard evidence about his presence in Angie's circle. They heard testimony from witnesses. And despite the absence of any physical evidence linking Tapp to the crime, despite the DNA evidence that excluded him, the jury convicted him. In 1998, Christopher Tapp was found guilty of first-degree murder, rape, and use of a deadly weapon. He was sentenced to 30 years to life in prison. He was 20 years old. Throughout the trial and in the years that followed, there was one person who never fully accepted the narrative that the police had constructed. That person was Carol Dodge, Angie's mother. Carol Dodge had been shattered by her daughter's death. She described her system shutting down completely on the day she learned that Angie had been murdered. She had to be told multiple times before she could process what was happening. The woman who had rocked her daughter in her arms the night before she died, who had heard Angie say, "I love you," as she drove away from the house, was now confronted with the knowledge that her daughter had been brutally killed. The pain was absolute. But Carol Dodge was also a woman of formidable determination. She was not a woman to accept injustice quietly. When she felt the police were not pursuing leads aggressively enough, when she saw them sitting at their desks with their feet up rather than working the case, she did not accept this. She began printing thousands of flyers. She walked the streets of Idaho Falls. She offered a $5,000 reward for information. She was called a crazy, grieving mother by some, but she did not care. She was obsessed with finding Angie's killer, and she refused to accept the path of least resistance. Carol attended every day of Christopher Tapp's trial. She was present in the courtroom, a visible reminder of her daughter's death, a mother seeking justice. But as the years passed and as Tapp remained in prison, something began to shift in Carol's thinking. She requested to see the videotapes of Tapp's interrogations. She watched them, and what she saw disturbed her profoundly. She shared the tapes with Stephen Drizin, the false confession expert, and Drizin confirmed what her instincts had already told her. Christopher Tapp had been manipulated into confessing to a crime he did not commit. Carol Dodge became an advocate for her daughter's actual killer to be found, and she became an advocate for the man wrongfully imprisoned for her daughter's murder to be released. For 20 years, Christopher Tapp remained in prison. He became, in a sense, a part of the punishment for a system that had failed. The DNA evidence sat in cold storage, pristine and waiting, a complete genetic profile of a killer that nobody had yet identified. The police continued to search, but their methods yielded little. In 2014, they used the DNA to search a genealogy database owned by Ancestry.com, one of the first efforts to use public genetic genealogy databases in criminal investigation. They found a match, a man named Michael Usry Sr., who shared 34 out of 35 DNA markers with the killer. But further investigation revealed that Usry was a red herring. He was not the killer. He was simply a relative of the killer, someone who shared the family's genetic signature, but not the specific profile from the crime scene. The case continued to frustrate investigators and advocates alike. For years, the DNA sat there, begging to be matched, but the technology to find the killer was not yet available. Then, in 2017, something changed. Tapp's rape conviction was vacated. His murder sentence was reduced to time served. He was released from prison after 19 years, after nearly 2 decades of his life had been taken from him. He left prison in 2017, but he was not exonerated. His murder conviction still technically stood, a permanent mark against his name, but at least he was free. And then, in 2019, the breakthrough came. A forensic genealogist named C.C. Moore, working with Parabon Nanolabs, began building family trees from the DNA profile of Angie Dodge's killer. Using public genetic genealogy databases, Moore constructed the potential family connections of the perpetrator. Through meticulous work, examining family lineages and genetic markers, she narrowed down a list of possible suspects. 7 people of interest emerged from her analysis. Among them was a man named Brian Lee Dripps Sr. Investigators learned something remarkable about Dripps. He had lived across the street from Angie Dodge in 1996. He had been questioned by police at the time of the murder as a possible witness, but he had not been identified as a suspect. Then he had moved away, and he had faded into obscurity. By 2019, he was living in Caldwell, Idaho, on the other side of the state. The police began to surveil him. They waited patiently for an opportunity. They needed his DNA to confirm that he was the perpetrator. They could not simply ask him. They needed something voluntary, something discarded, something that could not be challenged. They followed him for hours. They waited. And then Dripps threw a cigarette butt out of his car window. Police officers rushed to retrieve it from the road. They sent it to the laboratory. Within 24 hours, the DNA from the cigarette butt matched the profile from Angie Dodge's crime scene. They had found him. After 23 years, they had finally identified the killer. On May 15, 2019, Brian Lee Dripps Sr. was arrested. During the interrogation that followed, an interrogation strikingly different from the one Christopher Tapp had endured, conducted by officers aware of the dangers of coercion, Dripps was confronted with the DNA evidence. He was told that his DNA matched the evidence from Angie Dodge's body and Angie's apartment. He was told that there was no escape, that science had identified him as the perpetrator. And Dripps confessed. According to police records and court documents, Dripps told investigators that he had gone to Angie Dodge's apartment with the intention to rape her. He was, he said, all messed up on coke and drunk. He had a pocket knife with him. He told them that he did not intend to murder her, that it just happened. He said he did not remember slitting her throat, but he did not deny that he had done it. In the cold, clinical language of the interrogation room, he admitted to the rape and murder of an 18-year-old girl. When Christopher Tapp heard the news that DNA evidence had finally identified the real killer, he was living a life that had been reconstructed from the ruins of his wrongful conviction. He had married. He had a full-time job. He was, despite everything that had been stolen from him, attempting to be a productive member of society. On July 17, 2019, a judge vacated Christopher Tapp's murder conviction. As far as the court is concerned, you are cleared of the charges you have been living under for the past 20 years plus, Judge Alan Stevens stated in his decision. Tapp walked out of the courtroom a free man, exonerated of the crime that had consumed the better part of his adult life. He had spent over 20 years imprisoned for a murder he did not commit, subjected to coercive interrogation tactics that produced one of the most contaminated false confessions in modern criminal justice history. And still, the case was not truly closed. Brian Dripps remained to be tried, convicted, and sentenced. In February 2021, Dripps appeared in court for his sentencing hearing. He pleaded guilty to first-degree murder and rape as part of a binding plea agreement. During the hearing, his defense attorneys attempted to present him as a man with a troubled life, an adoptee who had joined the Marines, who had become a father of 3, whose life had taken a dark turn on one terrible night. They noted that the crime had occurred over a 20-minute window on one evening nearly 25 years prior. They emphasized his declining health, a heart attack he had suffered while in jail, chronic conditions that would likely mean his sentence amounted to a life sentence. One of Dripps's attorneys, Elisa Massoth, told the court, when talking about his declining health, he thought this was God's way of punishing him for what he did to Angie. So I can tell the court that he has felt bad, he has felt horrible, felt remorseful about what happened. But the prosecutor, Deputy Attorney General Jessica Queen, offered a different perspective. She pointed out that Dripps had lived 23 years as a free man, knowing what he had done, knowing that someone else was serving time for his crime, and yet he had never come forward. Where was the remorse? She asked the court. Every day he woke up and refused to take accountability for his actions. Angie's brothers, Todd and Dodge, gave victim impact statements. Brent Dodge spoke of the chaos that the crime had caused, chaos that would persist for a lifetime. Todd laid out a large photograph of the crime scene, a graphic image of what Dripps had done to Angie. He described her death as an atomic bomb dropped on the Dodge family and the entire community. Angie is crying out, asking you to hear her voice, he told the court, to hear her words of how this crime impacted her. Carol Dodge, Angie's mother, spoke to the court in her victim impact statement. After more than 2 decades of fighting for justice, after watching an innocent man imprisoned while the real killer remained free, after using her own investigative efforts and her relentless advocacy to help solve the case, Carol addressed Dripps directly. "You have shattered our family," she told him. "There is no way to pick up the pieces ever again. You, Brian Dripps, deserve eternal hell." Judge Joel Tingey handed down the sentence, 20 years to life in prison. Dripps would be eligible for parole after 20 years, but given his declining health and the binding nature of the plea agreement, it was understood that he would likely spend the remainder of his life incarcerated. In addition to the prison sentence, Dripps was ordered to pay $10,000 in fines. You look at crimes like this, and it's impossible to quantify how much damage has been caused, Judge Tingey said from the bench. It's spread wide. The case of Angie Dodge is many things. It is a portrait of senseless violence, of a young life destroyed in its infancy. It is a story of a mother's unwavering determination to seek truth and justice, refusing to accept easy answers, continuing to fight even when everything seemed hopeless. It is a narrative of one of the most profound failures in modern criminal justice. The wrongful conviction of an innocent man, his imprisonment for more than 20 years, and the systematic mishandling of DNA evidence by the police. But it is also a case that raises deep questions about human nature, about the systems we build to protect ourselves, and about what happens when those systems fail. How is it possible that an innocent young man could be convicted on the basis of a coerced confession when DNA evidence existed that could have exonerated him immediately? How is it possible that a mother had to become her own investigator? had to teach herself about DNA technology and genealogy, had to become relentless in a way that no grieving parent should have to become, simply to find her daughter's actual killer. How is it possible that a man could walk free for 23 years, knowing he had committed a horrific crime, while another man served time in his place? The answer lies partly in human psychology, partly in institutional failure, and partly in the nature of how investigations can become corrupted when they develop tunnel vision. The police became convinced, early in the investigation, that Benjamin Hobbs was involved. When Hobbs's DNA did not match, they did not step back and reconsider. Instead, they focused on Christopher Tapp. When Tapp's DNA did not match either, they did not acknowledge the fundamental flaw in their theory. Instead, they used interrogation techniques proven to produce false confessions to extract admissions from him that he had participated in the crime. In the interrogation room, the rules of evidence were suspended. The absence of Tapp's DNA at the crime scene should have been exculpatory. It should have proven his innocence. Instead, the police suggested that perhaps he had not participated in the sexual assault, that perhaps someone else had been responsible for that part, that perhaps his role was more limited. They suggested that the polygraph machine could read his mind, could detect his lies, could prove guilt that the DNA evidence could not. They fed him information about the crime and then claimed he had provided it. They threatened him with the death penalty. They offered immunity and then revoked it. They broke him down psychologically until he would say whatever they wanted to hear. This was not just a failure of individual detectives. This was a systemic failure. The videotapes were made, which was good. But the videotapes were not carefully reviewed at the time to identify the coercive tactics being employed. The DNA evidence was collected, which was good. But once it became clear that Tapp's DNA did not match, the system did not stop. It did not say, "This man cannot have been the perpetrator." Instead, the system moved forward, driven by the need to close the case, by the momentum of the investigation, by the simple human tendency to defend a position once it has been taken. In many ways, the case of Angie Dodge is a case about how systems can become instruments of injustice. The criminal justice system exists to protect the innocent and to punish the guilty. In the case of Angie Dodge, it did the opposite. It punished an innocent man while protecting for more than 2 decades the guilty one. There is another thread running through this story, though, and it is a thread of redemption. Carol Dodge refused to accept what she was told. She questioned the narrative. She fought against institutional inertia. She became an advocate for her daughter's actual killer to be found, even though it meant questioning the conviction of the man sitting in prison. This took courage. This took a willingness to stand against conventional wisdom, and it ultimately led to the truth. The advances in DNA technology, particularly the development of genetic genealogy, provided the tools that made the final resolution possible. A cigarette butt, discarded casually into the street, became the key that locked Brian Dripps into justice. In a sense, the very thing that had failed to identify Angie's killer in 1996, the DNA evidence, ultimately provided the tool for his identification in 2019. And the story of Christopher Tapp is one of resilience in the face of profound injustice. He lost more than 20 years of his life to a crime he did not commit. He was imprisoned during the years when he should have been building a career, raising a family, making a life. He was subjected to interrogation techniques designed to break him psychologically. He was convicted on the basis of a confession extracted through coercion, and yet when he was finally released, he did not descend into bitterness or despair. He married, he worked, he attempted to rebuild what had been taken from him. He did not get justice. No amount of financial settlement can repay 20 years of stolen freedom. But he got something, a second chance. But the broader implications of this case extend beyond the individuals directly involved. The case of Angie Dodge is a case about what happens when systems become corrupted by certainty, when investigators become convinced of a narrative and then work backward to fit evidence into that narrative rather than following the evidence wherever it leads. It is a case about the danger of false confessions, about the psychological vulnerability of young people interrogated by trained professionals, about the fallacy of treating polygraph tests as if they were infallible scientific instruments. The case also raises questions about the adequacy of our legal system's mechanisms for catching and correcting errors. DNA evidence existed that could have freed Christopher Tapp immediately, but it took more than 20 years and the intervention of advocacy groups for that evidence to be properly utilized. The system was supposed to protect the innocent. It failed. It took extraordinary efforts outside the normal functioning of the system to correct that failure. There are lessons here about humility in the pursuit of justice. There is a lesson about the danger of tunnel vision. There is a lesson about the importance of carefully reviewing interrogation videotapes to identify coercive techniques. There is a lesson about the need to take DNA evidence seriously, to use it properly, and to let it guide investigations rather than being selectively deployed to support a predetermined conclusion. There is also a lesson about the power of persistence, about the importance of individuals like Carol Dodge, who refuse to accept injustice, who continue to fight even when the system seems arrayed against them, who ultimately help to correct the course of justice, even if it takes decades. The case of Angie Dodge ended on a spring morning in 1996. She was found in a pool of blood in her apartment, the victim of violence so extreme that she was nearly decapitated. In a sense, the case never truly ended, though. The repercussions rippled outward for nearly a quarter of a century. An innocent man was imprisoned. A guilty man remained free. A mother searched for answers. A community was traumatized, and the criminal justice system was confronted with a clear example of its own fallibility. But perhaps, in the end, there is a larger truth embedded in this story. It is a truth about what it means to be human, about our capacity for both terrible violence and profound compassion, about our need for justice and our difficulty in achieving it, about the institutions we build to protect ourselves and the ways those institutions can fail, and about the individuals, like Carol Dodge, who refuse to accept those failures, who persist in the face of institutional indifference, who ultimately help to bend the arc toward justice, even if it takes far longer than it should. Angie Dodge was 18 years old. She had a whole life ahead of her. She had graduated from high school with honors. She had just taken her first steps toward independence. She was intelligent and strong-willed and full of the promise that 18-year-olds carry. That promise was cut short on a June morning in 1996 by a man under the influence of cocaine and alcohol, who decided for whatever reason, perhaps for no reason at all, to commit an act of violence that would echo across more than 2 decades. In the years that followed, that act of violence did not just destroy Angie, it destroyed Christopher Tapp. It traumatized her family, it challenged the assumptions we hold about justice and fairness and the adequacy of our legal system, and it demonstrated in stark terms the absolute necessity of individuals like Carol Dodge, people who refuse to accept injustice, who persist in the face of institutional failure, who ultimately hold the system accountable, not through the regular functioning of that system, but through extraordinary determination and an unwillingness to accept easy answers. The case of Angie Dodge is closed now, legally speaking. Brian Dripps is in prison for the rest of his life. Christopher Tapp is free and has received a settlement. The killer has been identified and convicted. But the deeper questions the case raises remain open. They remain a challenge to us as a society, a reminder that the pursuit of justice is never finished, that vigilance is required, that the ordinary functioning of our institutions is not always sufficient. And they remain a tribute to those individuals, like Carol Dodge, who refuse to let the truth be buried, who persist in seeking it, who ultimately help to ensure that even when systems fail, the search for justice continues. The wound that Brian Dripps inflicted on Angie Dodge's body in the early morning hours of June 13, 1996, was deep and fatal. But the wounds his act created in the Dodge family, in Christopher Tapp, in the community of Idaho Falls, and in our collective faith in the justice system, those wounds remained open for a long, long time. And in many ways, they remain open still, a permanent reminder of what happens when the pursuit of justice goes wrong, and what it takes to set things right.